Sun drying is one of the oldest methods to process tea, and it is still quite widespread nowadays. But how does sun drying affect tea leaves? Let's find it out together in this video. Hi guys, this is Gabriele from nannuoshan, where we share the pleasure of drinking and discovering genuine farm tea. If you're new in our channel and you're also looking to expand your tea knowledge and brewing skills, make sure to click on the subscribe button and don't forget to give us a thumbs up if you enjoy watching this video. Today we are going to speak about sun drying, a method of processing tea leaves. And you know, all tea leaves are actually dried. At the very end of their processing, they have to be dried, and they have to be dried below a moisture content of 9%, otherwise they would perish. So the drying is something that is really common to all tea, and there are different ways of drying the tea. One of them is at the sun. Now, before we look into the details of sun drying and how it affects tea leaves, we have first of all to find out which teas are actually sun dried. The most classic example is actually white tea, and that's why I have chosen actually a white tea for today. So I'm going to prepare this white tea, and white tea is processed in a very simple way. It is basically only done in two basic steps. The first step is the withering of the leaves, and the second step is the drying process. Now, interestingly enough, sun drying, it is used to dry the white leaves, but there is always an additional step at the end to further fixing the taste of white tea. So sun drying is not the last step in processing white tea. It is the one before the last. And this is not the case for other teas. If you take, for example, green tea can be processed in many different ways. You know, there is green teas that are stir-fired, others that are steamed, others that are baked, and some of those methods are also used for drying the leaves, and one of them it is sun drying. So in the case of green tea, it is really, when it is displayed at the sun, it is really meant as a final step to dry the tea leaves, differently than in white tea. And then we have, for example, Pu'er, which is also a classic tea that is dried at the sun, and in that case it is a step in between. So it is used to dry the tea leaves, but most of the time, you know that after the sun drying you have matcha, and then you have to, or you don't have to, but most of the case you go ahead and press actually the tea leaves, right? So that we've seen how in white tea is kind of more or less the beginning of the process with the withering done at the sun. In green tea is at the very end, and in Pu'er is somewhat an in-between step, if you want. You see how clear is actually this tea. White indeed, I would say. All right. So this is about the basics of the different type of tea that are processed under the sun. There are other teas that are processed under the sun. I have seen black tea being dried under the sun. It was more of an experiment done in Longines when I was visiting, but I know that in Yunnan there are also black teas that are really processed regularly dried under the sun. But we will leave this category aside because it's more of an exception, while in the case of white tea, of green tea and of Pu'er, it is a common method for processing the leaves. So we will look into each of them to see how sun drying affect the taste. But before looking at the different categories, let's first think about how actually, oh, I made it a bit too full, how actually sun drying is different than other drying method. First of all, one basic difference is the temperature. If you place the leaves at the sun, they won't increase very much in temperature, while if you bake the leaves or if you stir fry the leaves, they really go pretty much high with temperature. So the temperature is definitely a difference. Another difference is that at the sun you have also UV rays that hit on the leaves for quite some time, because sun drying is done for a long period of time, and those leaves bring energy, may break even some molecules, may induce some transformation in the tea that otherwise is not happening. And of course, sun drying is done at the air, at free air, so there is if you want, maybe a risk of losing some of those volatile compounds on the surface of the leaves that simply evaporate and disperse at in the air, yeah, if you just leave the leaves there for a while. So these are some basics idea about how sun drying may influence it, but at the very end, in the final product, how can you recognize, or can you recognize, if a tea was actually sun dried or not? And just a second. So let's start with white tea. Maybe we said white tea is the most traditional tea that is processed in the sun. How sun drying affects white tea? Well, one aspect that is affected is aging. The aging of white tea. And why? Because the long withering at the sun dries the leaves, but do not dry the leaves excessively so. And it is a very slow process in which it is allowed to the polyphenols and other substances in the leaves to already start actually a certain evolution. At the very end, there is a final fixing, we say, a final drying, not at the sun. It can be done with hot air, it can be done in the oven, but that final drying lasts just very shortly because the leaves are almost already dry. They just have to lose another tiny bit of water content. So that final step of drying after the sun drying is the final step of fixing, if you want. Do not bring a lot of heat, if you want a lot of damage, let's say, in the leaves. It's not a matter really of damage, it's rather that if you eat up the leaves very much for a long time, you actually stop some of the aging process. While if you don't do so, because you have already aged the leaves at the sun, you give more room, more potential for aging later on. Be aware that it's a bit tricky. It's not a black and white thing. Oh, this white tea is not really changing much over the year. For sure, it wasn't sun dried. Oh, this one is changing a lot. It was sun drying. It's not really like that, because you can avoid sun drying, and many large producers do so because it's extremely time consuming. So they would wither the leaves indoor in large pools, actually, with a forced air flow. But that doesn't dry the leaf as much as under the sun, and then they dry them farther in the oven. But if they control the process and they don't use a very high temperature of the oven or a very high temperature of the air flow, then they do a process that is a little bit longer and smoother and less aggressive and lower heat, so closer to the sun drying. So by tuning those parameters, temperature and duration of the machine dry, they could actually reach a similar result in terms of aging potential. But as a general principle, you can say that sun drying give more room for aging. Moreover, we have to say that actually white tea is one of the oldest type of tea, and there is a very old say in China for white tea that goes like this. It says that white tea after 1 year is tea, after 3 years is medicine, and after 7 years is treasure. So already centuries ago there was the practice of aging white tea. In fact, I would say it is the oldest tea that was regularly and intentionally aged, well before Pu'er and other types of tea that today, like Taiwan oolong for example, that today we are used to age. So at that time, or even before that time, we have to assume that sun drying was really one of the first processing methods, because it doesn't require any machine, nothing. You just pick up the leaves and you leave them at the sun. So must have been one of the very first methods, even without the final step of machining. Of course, those leaves were not lasting very long, because if you don't dry, if you don't do that final fixing, your leaves are a little bit too wet, and even if it is a tiny bit too wet, over the years they will decay rather than gain in taste. So this is about aging. It's a really nice tea. As you see, and I've just opened the package. We had this in the past year, and now we have just purchased the new one the year after, and it's very refreshing. And as you see, this white tea actually was pressed in a brick, in a cake, which is a process that usually, not usually, in the last 15 years is also done for white tea, taken over from Pu'er. Anyway, now we have spoken about the sun. I guess we have said that if it ages, if it does not age, a white tea could be because of the sun. What else does sun drying influence in white tea? A very specific aspect of white tea is the fact that immediately after the harvest, the first few months, it tastes extremely green, extremely grassy. It tastes like fresh grass. And this is an aspect that is caused by the sun drying. If you would intensively machine drying the leaves, they would lose that extremely fresh and grassy taste. It's not necessarily a pleasant taste, it's relatively aggressive to the stomach, and it's a little bit harsh. It's also difficult to spot all the florality of the tea because that grassiness is overwhelming, but in just a few months will be gone. So if it is a spring tea, white tea, after the summer that grassy taste is gone. And in fact, usually here in the West, we do not experience that, because by the time the tea made its way from the tea garden to our cup, those few months are already gone, and you don't experience that. You have really to go to China, to the harvest region, and try there the few days after the harvest. The green taste, as said, is very peculiar of sun drying, and if it lasts too long, not only a few months, but after half a year, after a year you still have it, it means that the leaves were not completely dried. Another aspect that is interesting about white tea and sun is that actually Chinese tends to say that white tea smells and tastes like the sun. Now, I don't know if you know how sun tastes, but in case you do and you taste that in white tea, that means it was sun-dried. And you see also a very different attitude and approach that Chinese have with respect to us. They are more philosophical, spiritual if you want, in their approach to tea. We are very scientific. For example, we really are interested in which is the effect of the specific Ising clay, of that centigrade more in temperature or less, and so on. Chinese tea lovers usually don't care. They see more this type of aspect, the fact that white tea does taste like the sun and smell like the sun as well. And this is pretty much all the aspect I would say it's worth mentioning about how sun drying affect white tea leaves. We said, summarizing, aging, we mentioned the green taste right after the harvest, and we mentioned also the smell and taste of sun. Now, let's look about the next one. Let's look about Pu'er. I just warm up a bit the temperature. My tea is unfolding. It was just a small cube. You've seen that before. Not sure that I can bring it close enough to the camera for you to see. I tried. It is still a small brick, but it will unfold into loose leaves very soon. Okay, so I think that's sufficient for my white tea. I will use a little bit less water because this guy one is quite elegant, but it's also quite tricky to use. As you see, there is no tapering rim, so this tends to become really hot and need a little bit of carefulness. Is that a word? Carefulness? I'm not sure. Anyway, Pu'er. What does sun drying affect into Pu'er? Again, like for white tea, it is said that sun drying affect the potential of aging, the conversion space the Pu'er has after it is dried. Nowadays, many companies and even farmers leave the sun drying for a machine drying. They use hot air, they use oven because it's much more convenient. And I've seen, of course, in Yunnan sun drying at the sun. So after the whole night, basically in the morning, they would take the leaves, the farmer would take the leaves, they would spread the leaves on bamboo mats, usually in their house, just in front of the house, and wait half a day or the whole day. If the sun is quite strong, half a day is enough to dry the leaves. Now, for Pu'er, as said, if it is dried in the oven, you reduce even more the water content, because we said in this case there is no additional step like for white tea. So if it is drying at the sun, that's it. It's dried at the sun and then is shipped to the factory, and in the factory it is pressed and that's it. So another aspect that sun influences is how bitterness affects the leaves. Now, not all, and I forgot again my tea, not all the Pu'er is actually what I wanted to say, doing two things here at the same time. Not all Pu'er is actually bitter, so it depends, but there are regions in which Pu'er is notoriously bitter, and sun drying can affect that bitterness. In which extent? Actually, if a tea is dried at the sun, it tends to be quite bitter early on at the beginning, but that gives more potential for aging, we said, because the leaves are not that dry, have not been heated at very high temperature for very long. So in that case, the leaves would change over the year and become mellower. While if that step is not done, is done in a machine, it is machine dried, then the leaves wouldn't have that level of bitterness at the beginning, but while they age, they might develop a little bit of bitter taste. Similarly to what you might have experienced in green tea, that if you store green tea for a long time, then it loses all its aroma and it becomes a little bit bitter. Turning yellow now, but also we have to say I forgot the tea, so in the guy one, as usually. Okay, so this is a few aspects that I would say is worth mentioning about Pu'er. Definitely the aging potential and the bitterness. As said, if a tea is fresh and there is no bitterness, it doesn't mean that it was machine dried. It could be that it comes from a region where the leaves, the specific cultivars that are there, have less bitterness, yeah. But if you have the opportunity of trying exactly the tea from the same garden, maybe harvesting the same time, in one case sun dried and the other case machine dried, then you would notice that type of difference. Now, since we mentioned it, let's speak also about green tea. Before doing so, I wanted to tell you one thing. I told you that in white tea, the sun drying is not really a drying, it's more of a withering, while in green tea and in Pu'er, it is indeed a drying process. So in fact, in Chinese, while we say just sun drying, there are two different words to address white tea and green and Pu'er. For white tea, they say it is, I have to think, it is Yangguang Wei Diao, which means Yangguang means at the sun, Wei Diao means withering, so it's withering at the sun. Another way of calling it is Ziran Wei Diao, which means Ziran means natural, so it's the natural withering. They don't use the word really drying for white tea. Why? In the case of green tea and in the case of Pu'er, the process at the sun is called differently. It is called shaiqing. Now, shai means sunning, like kind of a verb, like being at the sun, sunning something. So it is sunning the green leaves meant, which, be aware, is different than shaqing, which is killing the green. So it's very similar. Sha, first tone, and shai. There is an I at the end, and it is a fourth tone falling. Shai. So shaqing is, we say, sunning the green, and shaqing is killing the green. Both processes that are done in Pu'er and in some green teas. Now let's look at green tea. What can we tell about the effect of sun drying, of shaiqing on the leaves of green tea? Well, I would say that here is more of a classic example where you can really tell there is a difference in taste. It doesn't have to come only specific with the sun drying, maybe it's the whole series of things, but you can see that way that a little bit you can tell by the taste of a tea how it was processed. Think about at Enchiyulu, or most notoriously for us is the Japanese green tea, which is steamed. It is steamed and then dried. Now, a steamed green tea have a clear umami taste. The leaves are not heated very high, they are heated just on with vapor, so it's just about 100 degrees centigrade vapor. They're not heated at a very high temperature, so have more of a green taste, umami, some algae taste in it. While if we take the classic stir-fried tea, like Longjing, like Biluochun, that are stir-fried in the wok, actually there we have that the process of killing the green, shaqing, and of drying is done at the same time in the wok. In that case, due to the high temperature of the stir frying, of the roasting if you want, you get more aroma in the tea. You get more aroma, a very vivid green color. Similarly, like when you stir fry vegetables in a wok, you get all those savory notes that are not there in a fresh vegetable. So that's the case for stir-fried tea. Now, if we look at another way of processing green tea, is baking. So you do the kill the green and then you bake the tea, the leaves in the oven. When you do so, and classic examples are Huangshan Maofeng, Luang Guapian are baked tea. First of all, the color of the leaves is more intense, is a darker green, and more in the direction of emerald. Think about Luang Guapian, how dark those leaves are. And in terms of taste, the aroma, the level of the aroma is a bit mellower than in stir-fried tea. So you have Longjing, Biluochun are very apparent and present, while Huangshan Maofeng and Luang Guapian might be a little bit more subtle in taste. And now if we take finally sun-dried green tea, we have classical example in Yunnan, for example. In that case, well, I have to say that the leaves are fairly dark, are not very vivid in color, are fairly dark, and the aroma is very low. The aroma is very low, but what there is a strength, there is an intensity, there is how can I say, there is richness in taste. So there is a lot of body in those teas. So given this fact, I would say that sun drying is giving more body to the tea, but at the same time, since the temperature is not very high, it doesn't transform, it doesn't bring about those processes that results in that classic aroma of, for example, roasted stir-fried tea, like Longjing we said in Biluchan. So I hope that I was able to give you an overview of how sun drying affect tea leaves. Is a complex matter, and is not something where you can tell, yeah, just black and white as we said before. It is specifically these aspects. If you see that, for sure it is sun dried. If you don't see that, it's for sure not sun dried. You need a lot of experience, a lot of drinking, but I hope that this will help you in finding out which tea you're drinking. Thanks a lot for watching. Don't forget to subscribe our channel, and to give us a thumbs up if you've enjoyed watching this video. Thanks a lot guys, and I will see you at the next one. Bye bye.